My name is Mamduh Halawa, and right now I study at the psychologist program in Uppsala University. And in November 2018, I released this popular science book called Like, which covers the impact of social media on our cognition, behavior, and well-being. And why did I do this? I don't know, really. We had a lecture, I remember, where one of the lecturers talked about the increasing numbers of anxiety and depression among young populations. And there were a lot of theories for why this happened, but a lot of us in the program also wondered that maybe this would have something to do with it. And the lecturer wasn't really able to answer that question, even though she was quite senior in her. She was a researcher in that area, employed by the Swedish government, so she would know, if anyone. And that got me thinking, like, what does this thing do with us? So it led me into researching and reading up on it a lot. Eventually I had read up on so much of it and felt that if I had not turned it into something, I would have wasted a lot of time. So, yeah, that's it. So now it's available for people to read. And this is the basic structure. So I was interested in the, I'm sorry, it's a bit low. It says mechanisms down there. So I was interested in the fundamental mechanisms of how these things make money, how do they work, how do they manipulate us, if they manipulate us. And a bit less on the consequences on what that does to us, and even less on what you should do about it. Because I really don't feel qualified to tell people what to do on social media or if they should have social media at all. But the mechanism of how it works and why, that was very interesting to me. So if you read this book, you will see this sort of progression, a lot of base biological, statistical facts, and a few things on what you could do about it. Right. So the first thing we might ask us is, what is social media? And I found that a good way to think of social media is, you can imagine a marketplace, like a physical marketplace. And on this physical marketplace, there are a lot of stands. So these would be companies, and they have products. So the Facebook, for example, is that marketplace, and they invite people to come and buy other companies' products. So in order for this business model to be viable, you must have people in the marketplace. Otherwise, no company will pay you. Sorry? Yeah. I'm sure he'll come in eventually. Yeah. So, for this to be viable, there is an incentive to bring in people and make them be on social media for as long as possible, so that these companies can find people that can buy their products. And if you think about you sleep for 8 hours and you work and do other things for another 8. There are not a lot of hours during the day for you to pick maybe 1 to 4 apps that you will use throughout the day, because most people don't use more than 1 to 4 apps. And on App Store there are millions, about 2.5 million apps. So there's a huge incentive to get people into the marketplace. And this creates something that is known as the attention economy. So the view that attention is an economic product, that if it could be garnered, it could result in cash. So it's very, very, very good to get people on your platform. And you can get second-hand money from other companies. So this would just point out that the amount of apps and things is not reciprocal to the how many apps you would normally use. So there's an increasing competition to manipulate people to get in. So the next thing we could ask ourselves is, how good are they at this? How much do people use social media? So if we look at worldwide, we might see that around 2 billion people right now log into some sort of social media platform at least once a month. And the primary trend is that it is growing, and the growing is a result of the expansion of the internet, rather than people on the internet actually using social media. Because around 70 people with internet connection use social media, and that number is quite stable. But in Africa, for example, only 35% of people have an internet connection. And as they will inevitably have that, this will grow to about 3 billion users by 2021. So this will only get bigger and more central in our place. The next thing we might ask us is, now I put them at the wrong place. Never mind. So, how many people use it in Sweden? And I would just like to ask you, how many of you here have social media? So basically everyone. And there's a lot of statistics on this, but that is the general consensus, that almost everyone that has internet access, which almost everyone has, also has some kind of social media platform. So here in Sweden we are completely bathing in this. For example, if you look at 2-year-olds, 79% of 2-year-olds use internet. So it's a lot. This represents the individual user. For those of you from Sweden, you will know who he is, but it doesn't matter. So, on average, people, this you can measure by putting an application on people's phone and see how they divide their time on their phone. You will see that the most thing that people do is use some sort of communication apps. And of these, the specific Facebook, Twitter, social media apps are the biggest, and specifically Facebook. So on average, an average user uses social media, uses this for 150 minutes per day. But you also have a session of maybe 80 sessions a day. And most of these sessions is just looking at your phone. So if you might imagine, you just getting a notifications and looking without even opening, that counts as one session. So if we only have maybe 15, 16 hours a day, and we use this for about 80 times a day, we will not have a lot of minutes available, a lot of hours spent without this. So the central point here is that there is a clear difference between doing one thing for 150 minutes or doing one thing for 2 minutes 80 times per day. And this distinction, I think, will be clearer as to why that is and what it may do. But I think that might be something that's worth pointing out. It's not just solely the total time, but how you use it. Right, so I've said that we can be manipulated. What is it that can be manipulated? So then we might go back to how humans work. And you might look at this from 3 stages. So the first stage that we must look at is how is the brain developing? So the brain develops hierarchically, and it develops with plasticity. So hierarchically means that the most basic function, such as the brainstem, develops first, and then neocortex with inhibition and executive functions thereafter. And the other thing is plasticity. So depending on which neurons fire at the same time simultaneously, that will result in the resulting learning of behavior. So it's a bottom-up process of learning instead of a top-down process. So you might see this example of plasticity, for example, if you throw a ball to an infant, and what you will see is that all of the muscles or nearby all will be activated. And that is because infants have a huge database of neurons. They actually have a lot more neurons than us. But the network is not synchronized. They haven't trained on this. And therefore, none of these pathways through other neurons are trained. So this means that as you throw the ball to the infant, through a negative feedback loop, it will learn what to fire and what not to fire, and the activity of the network will be more precise and smaller. And this will result in the neurons that don't fire will be taken away by the brain because they are not used. And the pathways of the neurons that are activated together will grow into networks. So that's how it works. And this is how we learn. The second problem is that, yeah, it's a cute monkey. But the problem here is that, so we learn by going out, coming into stimuli and adjusting our responses and adjusting this network. But there's a lot of things we could do. So what should we do? And for this we have affects. So affects, you could think of emotions as subjective and affects as the physiological base of emotions. And so in a general sense we have positive affects, and these feel good, and they have certain neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. And there are negative affects such as fear or guilt, and these have other transmitters such as noradrenaline, for example, or GABA. So the thing is here that we have this system that will reduce the amount of stimuli that we should encounter with and develop our networks with, so that we will go forward to the things that are programmed to give us these positive affects through these neurotransmitters, and go away from the things that activate noradrenaline and GABA and make us feel frightened, for example. So this makes our perception a bit smaller, and we can pursue things that are good for development. But there's still a problem. So just because you have affects and you have a plastic brain, not a plastic brain, but a brain with plasticity, I'm sorry, doesn't mean that you can do a job like working at Impact Hub, for example, which is a very complex social job in which you need very specific skills. So for this, you would need a social group. And you might see this, for example, in that kids, young children that don't have parental or at least some kind of guiding group, when they grow up, will grow up with severe brain deficits. And this is because something that a Russian psychologist, that Pavlov, Russian Pavlov, he's called Pavlov, said, sorry? Ivan Pavlov, I'm sorry, yes. Called the proximal zone of development. So the thing is that you have your base here, which is the parent. And then you go out to your the limits of your ability, and when you go out and encounter the world through these affects that guide you to what you should go out to, then the networks get strengthened until it is too hard, and then you must return to your parent. And when you have returned, then you have learned something. And then when you have learned something, you can go a bit further and further and further until you develop a person that can be somewhat autonomous. And if you don't have that base, you will not learn these fundamental resources for how to encounter the world. So for example, you can see that in Romania, under the dictator Ceausescu, you can see that children that were brought up in foster care homes with almost no guiding parents at all, or no guiding parents at all, they were also severely mentally handicapped, and they could never learn to encounter the world in a proper way. So the central point here is that the affective system that drives us towards what to do and what not to do, these are in-programmed, and we don't have a control of them, and it will be activated by such things as sex, food, training, and a drive towards people. And this is why we want to be with people. It's not because we want friends, it's because we need it for a developing brain. For example, if you put someone, just any one of you or me, just put me in solitary confinement for 60 months, and then you look at my brain after that, you will see that there's been a significant damage to my brain that might be irreparable. So, the thing here is that if we could develop something, condition that something to these primal drives, such as going towards a group, it will inevitably activate these neurotransmitters that will make us go after it. And if people go after it, it being a marketplace, we could get them there, and we could make a lot of money off it. So that might be a theory on how to start a social media app. Sorry, I have to check if... Right. I'll take this before, actually. Right, yeah. So, I've told you now that you can be manipulated. But how do you do that? How do you go about manipulating people? So, here are a bunch of psychological mechanisms you can use. One thing you can use is something called intermittent reward. So what you see is that the timing of when you give people a reward will influence when they go after that same reward again. And it turns out that people will not go after a specific behavior if they are rewarded all of the time, and they will not go after a behavior if they're not rewarded at all. But they will go after behavior if they know they are rewarded, but they don't know when. So this is what casinos does, for example. So you pull that lever, you don't know when you're rewarded, but sometimes you will be rewarded. And there is just a randomness to that element. And that is what makes it so hooking. So in social media, for example, you can see that this same red little icon appears for birthday notifications, you being tagged in something. I mean, no matter what, it's the same thing. And that makes the reward very intermittent, because it could be something very positive or something very negative. And you will pull that lever in terms of looking at that notification, because you never know. So that's very smart. And you can also look at the, when you scroll down and see pictures and stuff.
The feed.
The feed, yeah, thank you. So what you will notice there is that one thing, it's unending. Anything can come up, and all of the content is in that same feed. So that makes it very intermittently rewarding as well, because you never know. So you keep pulling, like in a casino. So that's one smart thing that you can do. Another thing is that like button. A like button is surprisingly smart, because it turns out that the reward circuit, which handles these positive affects automatically, it is very hard for a human brain to see social approval, which is a primary drive. Because, for example, if I make a joke, I might make a joke that is not very funny, but you laugh because you want to be nice. Or we have a previous relationship where we make bad jokes, but we laugh regardless. Any number of these qualitative factors makes it very hard for me to understand when I'm getting this social approval and when not to. So if you could strip away these these qualitative differences and look at one quantitative thing, it being a point, then it would be very clear for the brain and the reward circuit to activate a neurotransmitter, because it will inevitably know that, this means social approval. It can't be anything else. Of course, you can still have some kind of sarcasm when you like pictures, but it becomes very weird in that case if you like pictures but you don't really like them. So if you can scale off the qualitative aspects and just have the same icon for every social approval thing, it makes it very rewarding, like a little sugar pill of dopamine. So that's one thing. Another thing you can do is that you will see that people that invest their time in things, they will inevitably tell themselves that they're doing it because they want to do it. Because there occurs a certain cognitive dissonance if you do something and you don't get a reward from doing it, but you have invested all of these resources. So you will tend to hang in there until it gets paid off. So this is, for example, why they have these groups and other functions to integrate with your work life and put all your friends there and your timeline from your birth, integrate your whole life and invest very much resources in it, And if you do that, people will hang on until it pays off, which I don't know how it would pay off, but yeah. This is something, don't make a cult, but if you make a cult, like a crazy, like Jamestown cult, what they do is they actually make you invest in something beforehand, and then you will stay just until it becomes something that you feel are rewarded for. But if you invest time and money into something, then you will stay for the most part, until you're rewarded, which you will never be if you're in a cult, for example. Something else is stop signs. So the body has stop signs for when we should stop doing something. So it's good to train, but we shouldn't train too much because the muscles will start to ache. And I mean, if we want to be good at football, we should play football, but we shouldn't play too much football because the body needs to recover. So in life there are all these different stop signs. And it turns out that if people don't encounter stop signs of some sort, the mode of being, if you enjoy to do it, is just to continue doing it forever, ever. And these apps are designed to make it as easy as possible to get in and never signal when to get out. And even if you get out, you will get the notification that you should get in there again. There is no incentive for anyone to make you stop scrolling. So there is nothing that signals that you will stop scrolling. And also because it's so like cognitively not very loading, you will stay there forever. Notifications as well. So this is basically conditioning. So you have used social media and you've conditioned a certain affect with social media, and you've not just considered like the intellectual thing called social media, but you have conditioned all of the colors and where you use it and when you use it and who you used to use it with and what friend is there. All of these things are encoded into a network in the brain. And the thing with networks in the brain is that this is called priming. So if you activate one little part of the network, then other things that are primed in that same network are more likely to come up into.
It's like the context.
Sorry.
Like the context.
The context, yeah, the situational context and like everything surrounding, yeah. And this will activate the reward circuit and again bring you into that thing. So that's why it's very good to intermittently send these signals, and as soon as you see it, doesn't matter if you don't want these notifications, it will prime your brain into adjusting your perception into what gave you this dopaminergic hit. It's not you're not aware of this. Right, and so how does this work? So if you look at how I have to think how I should lay this up. I'll say it like this. So if you look at how an addiction occurs, if this is an addiction, there is something called the theory of liking and wanting, which is central to know if something is addictive or not. So, and it's written by these guys, Redbridge and Robinson, which are not these guys. I used to make this a joke that this was not the guys, but it was these. But because you saw them beforehand, so it would not be funny. But it's these guys, it's not these. I just googled this. I googled scientists. This came up. It's not very fun. Yeah. So what it postulates is that when you do something that gives you a very strong hit, like cocaine or some behavior that's very fun, the first time the affect of liking will be released, and it will release serotonin primarily, but also other neurotransmitters. And then that creates a conditioning of what you did and what you took, and that response. But the thing is that the more you do this, like taking cocaine, the body will deregulate the response because it knows that it is a dysfunctional response. So it will make the dendrites, which are complex neurological things, they will rinse those, and it will change the receptors, do everything it can to make that first hit be a smaller hit in the future. But because you got such a strong hit the first time, you are conditioned to that effect. So you will keep doing it. And as you keep do it, then this situational context of who you did it with, how it looked when you did it, how it felt, these will be encoded into a separate network that is dopaminergic, not serotonergic, because it activates the affect interest, not like. So it's a difference between liking and wanting. So what this does is that the wanting aspect will be stronger, so you will want to do it more, but the liking aspect will be increasingly deregulated. So this is, for example, why you see that people that take cocaine or cocaine addicts, they don't even enjoy it anymore, but they do it in regardless. And that's because it doesn't matter that they're not getting the same hit. It matters that the dopaminergic network has been encoded into the behavior. And that's, for example, why you tell when you have someone who's a drug addict, you might tell him to switch city, the first thing. And that's because the situational context, which is the city, the friends, and all of that, how it looks, it activates, it primes these things. It primes this network, and it will guide your perception towards it. Right, so the thing is just interest and joy are separate affects, and they are separate networks. Okay, so these are just theories. I have made no claims on what this does, but we might ask us, is there any validity to what I'm saying? Do I have anything to back this up with, or am I just talking? And the first thing we might ask is, like, if this is an addiction. With an addiction, you must know that for something to be addictive, it has to be dysfunctional. That's the definition of an addiction. Otherwise, it's just something that you do a lot, and it's working for you. So if you use social media 1 million times a day, and you are functional, fully functional, and it actually helps you in your life, then it's not an addiction. It's just something you like to do. But what we might look at is we might look at something of how a good theory would be, how does the brain look like when we use social media? So that might be something we can look into. So what you could do is you could put people in fMRI scans, and you could look at their brains. And what you would see that you will show them pictures of likes, and you will see that the more likes one picture has, the stronger the activation of the reward circuit, which means it activates dopamine and serotonin. And you can also see that the more you have written that you use social media, the stronger this response. So if you have people that don't look at anything, look at something else, look at pictures of few likes, and look at pictures of many likes, you will see that there's a difference between not looking at anything and looking at likes, which gives you a dopaminergic boost. But there's also a difference on if you look at something with few likes or more likes, and something that has more likes will produce a stronger response in the brain. What we might also look at is something called flow. So any of you familiar with flow? I think it's quite I think most of you are. So flow might be categorized as when the affect of interest, one of these primary affects, and a certain stress response, when they reach a peak, when they are in perfect balance, you might say. Yeah. Okay. When they reach some kind of some kind of optimal peak, you will experience something that is called a flow. And this flow experience is when you push your ability in something that you really enjoy. Yeah. For example, if you like playing guitar and you play at the peak of your ability just before you can't play anymore, or if you like playing football and you play at your peak ability, this gives a sense of things flowing. It's a very nice feeling, and it messes with your perception of time, for example. So if you then put people in different conditions, so people that look at nothing, look at beautiful pictures, look at do some math equations, or scroll through social media, you will see that the flow is activated most in terms of positive affects and stress response when you scroll through your social media page. And there's actually a difference between when you do it in a stationary computer and a mobile phone.
Excuse me.
Yeah?
Can you explain what is flow here?
I want to explain it very well. So, flow is a term is used a lot in psychology, wherein you get a dopamine hit, so it feels good to do something, but you also get a slight stress response. And the dopamine hit is not very high, too high, and the stress response in like cortisol in your body is not too high. And when they reach a certain peak, you perform at your optimal performance, and it's very enjoyable. So this marker in terms of sweating on skin, and you can look at the brain activation, and you can also look at facial mimicry. You can see that this is activated when you scroll through a Facebook page. So all of these things we can see. So there has happened something. It's not just a stimuli like all others when they are presented to people. Something has been conditioned here. So these things I've talked about, they seem a bit more plausible now. So this is another theory. So it's called the dual system theory. And it says that if you will follow your if you will follow your drive, or you will inhibit a response in order to act on a long-term goal. So you won't eat candy when it's presented to you, because you know that in 5 weeks I will be standing here talking. Then there is two different networks, or they're not really networks, but places in the brain that sort of competing with each other. So you have this affective system, the reward circuit, that acts on these primary drives, and it will make you act on your impulses. But you also have something called the frontal lobe, and in here are things like inhibition, structure, planning. And these things, whichever of these is the strongest, it will win the war. So, this is something, this is the thing here. So, there are indicators that as people who use social media very much seem to have a smaller nucleus accumbens on average than people who don't use social media on average, and they also seem to have a stronger activation in that same area. So the theory is, for a couple of researchers here, that as you have for 80 to 100 times activated this place, there has happened something called pruning. So the nucleus accumbens, or the amygdala, the emotional responses, has been activated so many times that the brain has shrunken these areas and rinsed it of neurons that are not, they're in the way, basically. To just like with infant brains, making these areas smaller but more compact and with stronger connections, whereas these frontal lobes isn't impacted to the same extent. So the theory is that by doing this thing and getting a hit for so many times, we are rewiring the reward circuit and making it even less less likely for us to inhibit the response, because we're making the area stronger. So that might be what happens in the brain, that we're messing with our inhibition. But you have to say that the researchers are not sure if it is so that people that use social media very much have these differences in the brain, and that's why they use social media very much, or if it is the case that because they use social media that much, they are rewiring the brain. That we don't know, but we have seen that in alcoholic addiction, for example. So it fits quite well with like the theory of everything else, and it fits quite well with other addiction behavior, that you can shrink in this area and make it more impulsive. But we need long-term studies, so I have to say that, but I don't think that's right. So that's the biological aspect of it, and now we must ask ourselves, what about well-being? And there is a clear hypothesis in society that there is a hypothesis in society that the more you use social media, the worse you will feel. That's wrong. It's not the case at all. And that is because there are different factors. So social media is a very complex phenomenon, and you can use it in different ways, and it has different functions. And some of these things are good, and some of these things are bad. So the thing is, in research, a lot of scientists say that no, there's no correlation between well-being and social media use, because if you correlate how much people use it and how good they feel, you will find nothing. Very weak correlations. But that doesn't mean that there isn't causal effects, and that's because you're correlating it with everyone that use it in different ways, and then you will get no correlation. But if you look at certain factors, then you will see things that are more interesting. So, for example, there is, if you look at how many account, never mind, this doesn't matter. Right. So, what you will see if you look at a bunch of meta-studies, so studies upon a lot of studies on this subject, you will begin to separate two factors that you can see. So there is one factor that is primarily good and one factor that is primarily bad about these things. So the primarily good factor is, or the primarily bad factor is social comparison. So comparing himself to those two kissing. But the good thing is social capital. So these seem to be the two major factors in play here. And if you look at, for example, how comes that social capital is such a good thing on social media? You can look at one study of patients that were very depressed, so they were in a psychiatric place for very depressed people, and you could put them in different conditions. So just treatment with a Facebook account, and treatment with a Facebook account and your friend. Yeah, on there. And what you will see there is that for severely depressed patients, they actually responded better when they had a Facebook account, and even better when they had a Facebook, their friend on a psychiatrist there. But what's interesting is that most people didn't contact their psychiatrist. So what does that mean? It means that subjectively, if you perceive that you're in a network of that you have social capital, you have people to turn to when things go bad, that might be good for you. And for people that have major depression and haven't been out for maybe a year, your it's likely that your network of friends and relatives isn't that big. So just this Facebook account might do a big difference. So that might be a good thing. The bad thing is social comparison, and you see this as a red line through all of the different studies, some sort of comparison. And it is something about these medias that takes social comparisons that are regular and it turns them into very negative things. And there are several reasons for that. So one reason is it seems that evolutionarily we have primarily lived in groups of 125 people. So that's been our base for comparison. In social media, I would argue it's the double or even the triple of that for a lot of you in here. So you have a bigger base of comparison. You can also see that if you let people talk about themselves or talk about others, the reward circuit will get a stronger response if they talk about themselves than others. So it's inherently pleasurable to talk about yourself. But in real life, you can't do that, because if I just talk about myself, and there's a social cost to that, people might get annoyed. But if I can't see anyone, and I can talk about whatever I want, I'm going to talk about myself, because it feels good. So what you see is that 80% of the feed is self-referring. Always talking about yourself all the time. So we have a lot more comparisons. The comparisons are always about other people. Never has anything to do with something else.
It's ego book more than Facebook.
Ego book, yeah, that's a good name for it. Yeah. So you have those two aspects. Then you have a third aspect, which is called the availability heuristic. So what you can see in the brain is that things that are more available, we tend to think that they are more sannolika. What's that? Likely again. So, things that are more available, we perceive them as more likely. So, for example, people think that dying in an airplane crash is more common than dying in a car crash, which is the opposite. But the information of airplane crashes are much more available to us because it's become such a huge thing. So, for example, if you go out to this might have the evolutionary thing that the world mostly works like that, not like empirically, but for your survival. So if you go out to the forest 10,000 years ago, you would see that most trees are green. So therefore you would assume that, okay, trees are green. But in reality, you have seen maybe 0.00001% of the trees, and you said they are green, so every tree is green, which is almost delusional, but it works for the most part in the natural environment. So now you see people talking about themselves, and they talk positively about themselves, and this is the most information you're getting. So you perceive that, okay, people talk about themselves, and they always do these nice things. All people must always talk to themselves, and they must always do these nice things. This is the generalization you get. And you also have what's called another heuristic that states that if you see someone do something, you will more likely say they've done it because of an internal factor than an external factor. Because there are so many external factors and so few internal factors, it's much easier for your brain to hypothesize. So if people talk about themselves, always do nice things. Where was I? What was I talking about?
Internal factors and external.
Internal factors, yeah. So they're doing nice things, not because they're just in a nice place, because they are nice. There is an internal factor. So people are always talking about themselves. There are so many people to compare to. They are nice, and they are nice because of an internal factor. All of this boils down to something that makes people feel very bad on social media. So social comparison on social media is a very bad factor, and we should try to do something about it. What about stress? So if you research technologies and look at the stress response, you might look at different types of factors. So how much information is there on this technology? How difficult is it to learn this thing? How much do you communicate with other people? Are you communicating too much? And how much are you engaging with others? And it turns out that if you look at these factors in social media, you will see that the strongest predictor of feeling stress with social media is this social overload. So whenever someone does something and feels good or feels bad, for example, if I smile to someone, they will tend to also smile. It's implicit, it's in us to reciprocate. And if people are always telling about their own emotional, how they feel, and your implicit reaction is to always bounce that back, it might be that because of this large base of people talking about themselves and how they feel all the time, it might be that that system gets exhausted, and that's why you feel stress on social media, and after a while you say, I don't want to hear anything more about it. Like, for example, there's a lot of maybe sad stories and stuff like that, which is good that it gets out there, but if you're constantly in that and other friends are also talking about it, it gets too much for this thing in our brain. Right. So, what are the individual factors that decide which of these traps you will fall into, if you will use it in a good way or a bad way? And this is like the Matthäus principle that is written somewhere in the Bible, that to the rich, from the poor everything will be taken, and to the rich everything will be given. So it seems that weak inhibition, low intelligence, emotional instability, all of these things are correlated to the negative factors. And the other aspect of that seems to be that you use it in a positive way. So if you have these strong psychological barriers, you seem to be inclined to feel better on social media. But if you're already a bit in a rut, then you might not want to use this. But there's this thing with loneliness as well, which is complex. So that if you're very lonely, there's this social capital thing, so you might feel better about it. But the thing is that some people are lonely because they necessarily don't have the skills that would have made them engage out into the world. And it might be that if you're sufficiently lonely because of that, then you will use this as a substitute, and you will not go out into the world and get these real interactions that are fulfilling in another way. So there's a strange link between loneliness and social media, which sort of goes in a lot of different directions. So it's very complex. But in this you might say also, like children. So children have all of these abilities that are risk factors. If you look at a 25-year-old and a 12-year-old. Should children use social media? I don't know. We might talk about that later. The last thing we can look at is cognition. So what does this do with thinking? So we have different mental abilities. So we have inhibition, putting something away for a long-term goal. We have mental set shifting, so thinking in this way, then changing thinking in another way to different problems, not going about it the same way. And we also have something called the working memory. So the working memory is the area of bits of information that you can withhold at one and same time. And we don't really know how much information that is, but it's common to say that it's 7 plus minus 2 bits of information you can withhold at one time for 10 seconds to analyze that. And so we know that multitasking is bad for this ability, because you need to deeply encode information to get it from working memory to long-term memory in your brainstem so that you remember it for a long time. And deeply encoding things means occupying the full spectrum of working memory and deeply analyzing it, maybe referring it to something else. You need a lot of concentration and brain power, and it's actually not a very enjoyable process. But that's what's needed to get this from this place to the brainstem and the long-term memory. So we know that multitasking is, we see that people that do things a lot, different things, they do not get this deep encoding, and therefore they learn worse. And the theory might be that if you're doing something for 80 to 100 times a day, are you multitasking a lot? And if you are multitasking a lot, that would impact your cognition in terms of encoding information. So that's a theory. And what we might do then is look at correlational studies and then experimental studies. So if you take a bunch of students and you ask them how they're feeling, how much they use social media, how good they're academically, for example, and you see not just their grades, but when they study for how long, for example, you will see that the strongest predictor for low GPA in one big American study was the amount of multitasking outside of the classroom. That's a big difference, because it could have been not studying outside of the classroom, amount of not studying outside of the classroom. But it was actually the amount of you doing simultaneous things outside of the classroom. So it might be that if you're on this thing for a amount of time, you're not getting this deep encoding of information, and that might impact your GPA. And you might also see that, I forgot this. Right, so what you could see that is that people who multitask a lot did not study less. They actually studied a bit more than the others. And it might be that you will compensate, if your encoding is weak, you will compensate by studying more. So you will study for a longer period of time, but you will not encode the information as well. But these are correlational studies, so we can't say anything about causality. But then what we can do is we can set up experiments. So we can bring in a lecture, like something like this, for 20 minutes, let people listen and take notes, and after that we'll take a test. And what we will see is that in the conditions where people get texts from others, they will perform pretty consistently about 10% less in the following test. And they will take 50% fewer notes than the ones that did not get any stimuli. And this can be replicated in many studies. And 10% might not sound a lot, but it's a difference between a C and a D and an E and a D and an E, for example. So it's one hack up below. So if we put this thing, correlational findings and the causal findings in presenting social media, we might have an hypothesis that it might be a strong case that this is doing something with cognition. What you can also see is that in these lectures, the people know they can see the likes or whatever they're getting on their phone. But you can also do things that you let people do cognitive tests, and then let people do cognitive tests, and then you have just your phone on the side, doesn't vibrate or anything, face down. You will see that people who just have their phone face down, they will perform also 10% worse in these cognitive tests, even though they're not engaging. And you might do the same thing. You can talk to people and do the same experiment. Have nothing laying there, have a book laying there, or have your phone laying there. You will say that the people who just have a phone laying there, face down, they will report the connection between the one they're talking to as worse. They will feel less empathetic towards the story, and the more personal the story is, the more this effect will be seen. So, what does this mean? These things, all of the things I've been talking to, they're not aware processes. Because if they were aware, you would see that it's there and you wouldn't care. You would just focus on the process. But the thing is that this reward circuit, these networks that you've encoded for so long, they are automatic. and they will release these transmitters that will turn your perception towards what is conditioned to that affect. Okay, so what's the conclusion to all of this? I think that I really don't like self-help books, for example, because I think most people can learn to act quite appropriately if they just know how things work. So my suggestion for this, if you feel any of these things, is read up on this, and then you can experiment for yourself. Maybe turn off notifications, see what happens for a week. Maybe put a timeline, so you do this at 1 hour and not the other. For example, you can see what you should do in your own life. So I don't want to tell anyone what to do. But experiment and read up. And this knot here symbolizes that it's all interconnected. So the pruning of the amygdala, social comparisons, all of these things are part of the same thing. They're not separate factors, but in research you have to talk about separate factors because otherwise you can't understand anything. But in reality, it's all interconnected. And this is something that I'm personally a bit more passionate about. So this is something that I would have an opinion on. So these are kids here. And from the Matthew's principle, we could see that people that have these worse factors are impacted more. And there was a study on some school, I think I saw it a couple of weeks ago, when they just recorded how many notifications kids got in a regular class. It turned out to be like 2,000. And these were 12-year-olds. So if the Matthew's principle is correct, which it seems to be, and these kids are more vulnerable, and then we are like just throwing notifications in their face when they should be encoding information deeply. How could they possibly do that? And if they can't do that, why do we allow these things in schools? Like, I can see very many strong arguments for not allowing them in schools. I can see very few for having them there. So this is, for me, something I'm quite...
Sorry. I have a daughter.
Yeah.
She's 4 years and a half, and I also have my opinion. I really don't know what to do with this. I'm also reading a lot, and that's why I'm here as well.
Mm.
But my question is, the world is changing, right?
Yeah.
The education is changing as well.
Yeah.
And perhaps they are also developing by doing this some other capacities or some other abilities.
So you should probably not shield yourself if you're 4 years old and this will happen for the rest of your life. You should probably engage with it, but you should probably not engage in it when you should engage with other tasks. When you should encode information deeply, then you should just do that. And then you can do this as well, but you should have some time for your brain, especially if it's a developing brain, outside of that. So I think it's not wrong to have these things, but there's like a time and a place for it. That's what I think. So, yeah, that's basically it. Questions? Yeah, I can take you down there.
I have a question about the other side of the spectrum. I work with elderly people with a dementia and Alzheimer's diagnosis, and we're seeing an earlier diagnosis of Alzheimer's as early as late 40s and early 50s all across the world. And diagnosis is happening at a rate of 1 person every 3 seconds around the world. By 2050, it should be 150 million people with dementia. I work with some dementia, people living with dementia here in Stockholm, and with the younger generation of dementia diagnosed people, we're finding that they still want to hold on to social media because they've been primed with it for a while. And we're finding that the scrolling is that addict, is the addictive behavior of pulling the lever. And we don't know if it's giving them anything anymore because their neurons are we're at a palliative end of life care where the neurons are dying as opposed to growing. So I would really like to have if you consider social media and the elderly, the fastest growing demographic in the world are 80 plus.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that?
Right.
They're also living longer too, which is like
Yeah.
great, because a
Yeah.
couple of years back, you had Alzheimer's, it was like 6 years, 10 years, that's it.
Yeah.
Now they can pull it up to 15, 20,
Mm.
and it's a hard 15, 20.
Yeah.
And now they've got social media too. So we'd love to get your comments on that.
Yeah. So I haven't thought about that group. It's a very good question. What I would say is the social capital aspect is probably quite good for people in the late years. So in that aspect, it would be good. But in an ideal world, you would maybe remove these psychological mechanisms and just have them interact without all of this other stuff. Don't know how it can't be viable in a capitalistic marketplace, unfortunately, because you want other apps will do that, and they will have customers that you want. So it's a very hard question, but if you could in some way get this social media platform, build it up in another way, maybe finance it from another source so that it's sustained, then that would be good just for the social capital aspect, I think. But it's very hard to make these apps, and if you compete with other apps. But I still think that the social aspect thing could be good for the elderly. But I don't know how that would work in practice. That's my answer, I think. Yeah, is there anything else? Yeah, I can take you down.
Are you going to put up any basic references? Because you mentioned some research, etc. That would be nice to see.
Yeah, so I don't have it on here.
Okay.
The book is, there are 90 studies in this book, and it's everything I talked about. So if you would be so kind and you can see them all. You can go in and write another book based on this.
Is your book on Facebook?
Yeah.
That's
I have to make my own. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
The thing I'd love to see is to be able to turn off notifications on iPhone or Android without losing internet. Like when I go to sleep now, I don't flag mode because I don't want to have something pinging when I sleep. But when I wake up and I turn off flight mode, all the notifications come in. And it's just super weird how Apple does not provide like notifications on or off. Do not disturb. Yeah, they don't. Yeah,
Oh yeah, it's not
so that's like brain wiring skills and you're interacting with social media basically. Yeah, but that's like 1 minute a day.
We can do it for like a week.
Yeah.
So is there a question, or I don't know how to answer it.
Why the fuck is Apple not providing this? Like, now we're not addicted to smartphones. So Apple is as big of a thief as Facebook.
Yeah, we should try to solve that. Yeah. Not in their interest at all. Is anything? No, you had a hand.
Yeah, so if you were to recommend just regular people to do 3 things to be able to, coexist with social media in a better way, what would you recommend them to do?
Alright, so don't disable Messenger because you need to talk to people. That's what I do. But put a 1 hour limit on Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. So you can use that however much you want, but after that you get a block wall and you have to ask for permission. I think that's a good thing. That would be something. But other than that, experiment.
3 times 1 hour. And if you are only using Facebook,
No, it's the same. No, it's the
you
same.
can use 3 hours.
No, it's 1 hour for everything. It's like it doesn't matter how you locate your time. But you could do that as well. With 3 hours if you want. Yeah.
What do you think about Instagram removing likes? Is there kind of talking about?
What do they have instead?
Yeah, like they've been talking about a feature, been beta testing it, of hiding likes. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, they'll probably lose money. So they'll go back to it.
And how would you like an ideal social media to look like?
It's a good question. Yeah. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I'm sorry. I would love some suggestions. Yeah?
Yeah, I actually have one.
Oh.
So it's a private social network.
Okay.
And one thing is to actually base it on people you really know, and you have metadata so you can find your information. And of course, with a private social network, there is no advertising.
No.
So this is just to contact people. This isn't
Mm.
any commercial
Yeah.
stuff, but it's probably going to be to secure very important information rather than
Yeah.
just general chit chat. But you could use it like that to just to talk to your friends or family, real people in
Yeah.
private without any advertising, and also GDPR compliant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think fundamentally changing the business model from ad to something else.
There's something even more fundamental about that.
Yeah.
Just a brief point. If we carry on using social media at the rate we're doing,
Yeah.
by 2040, we won't be able to create enough power to handle it on the internet. It's just going up like crazy. So all this internet traffic is bad for the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, most things are bad for the environment. Unfortunately. Yeah. That's interesting. I can take your question.
What advice or guidelines might you give to brands or companies who are posting social media out to audiences? What kind of ethics or
So the ethics,
responsibility?
like, so you're in the game and you're contributing to this, but also it's hard for your business because you need to compete. So I don't really know how to solve that. No, I don't know, because you're contributing, you're paying them money, so I don't know, actually. It would be make some political, try to change the incentives from bottom up. I don't think you as a company can do anything, to be honest. But it's not your company, it's the incentives that are weird.
Now you mentioned political. I'm thinking you have been talking about manipulation, right?
Yeah.
But this is more like individual manipulation, like psychological manipulation.
Yeah.
But there is also social and political manipulation.
Yeah, I haven't covered it as extensively, but that's very, just the polarization and all of this stuff. It's also very prevalent in this. It's from the same base, but what you might say there is like people normally go towards people that have the same views, and there's also an incentive it's hard in the real world to do, but if you have this option of creating how many groups you want, and there are enough people, you could form these very strong collectives where you're always increasing your own views, and you're just talking to others, and this will make you more inclined to believe them. And this seems to happen. If you let people talk to whoever they want, they will talk to people that are like themselves, and then they will form groups, and then they will be more extreme. So that's a big problem as well.
But then we have these algorithms, I call them.
Yeah.
And this is what Zuckerberg wants.
Yeah.
So if he says, oh, now I want more extreme right, for example, that's what.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about. It's like how these corporations or these companies behind these social networks can manipulate how society thinks.
Yeah. No, there's actually a good study on that as well. There were some, Facebook did this. They altered the feed so that it selected more positive things to some people and more negative things to some people. And what you could see that people that encounter these positive things, so people would say, oh, I'm so happy today, they would also start to replicate that. They would start to talk like that as well. And people in the other feed, they will start to talk in another way. So you could manipulate that as well to show certain type of idea of how things should be. And you will see that people will start to talk like that as well if you show that in the feed. So, oh, I'm sorry. I'm not speaking. Yeah. Sorry.
Actually, initially you have mentioned that it is good to be on social media or being social. It is good for for the
It's my
growth
speech.
of the brain.
Yeah.
What your take on solitude? Like it is also good.
Yeah.
So how can you differentiate which part of brain is more active? Because I think I have seen many people who are not very active on social media.
Yeah.
But they are really very brilliant when it comes in the form of brain, their brain activation. So, just that.
Yeah, no,
Like
so
how on which study your like this result is based on.
no, so I'm not saying that people that use social media will have weaker intellectual abilities. I'm not saying that at all, because there's a lot of different factors and that influence cognitive ability, and this might be one of them, and it might influence inhibition and your degree of multitasking, which we know can affect how you store memory and if you can plan on long term to go towards long term goals. But then there are other things such as exercise, diet, social interaction in the real place, how stimulating your job is, how nice your mother is, like just all of these other things. So I'm not saying that this is not the sole factor, but I am saying that it might impact. It might have like 2% in the totality of it, something like that.
But isn't it contradictory that when we are on social media, our brain is so much engaged that we stop thinking, we stop using our brain, what we can think if we are not seeing or influencing by, not get influenced.
You're thinking still, but I mean, there's an alternative cost to everything. So if you were not on there, you would do something else that would engage your brain in another way. So it's very hard to make those kinds of statements. Or so I can take. Yeah, the time. So I'm ready. I can just take the last question.
No, I was just gonna ask because you mentioned that research was done in 2012, right, with Facebook. That's the ethics I'm trying to understand. Like, I don't know the field of study you're in, but
psychology.
Yeah, is it really ethical for them to just do an experiment to try to figure out people's emotional triggers without us being cool with it? Because that's the only thing that stresses me about social media. Is like they took it on themselves to just run an experiment. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, if you would run that in a review board for a science project, they wouldn't pass it.
So what would we?
Because you have to comply.
Exactly. So what can we do? Because so far they're just like.
So I write in the book about, Tristan Harris has this, he tries to make this political, they organize themselves and they try to tweak on the functions. So that would maybe be the way. But you have to, of course, raise awareness to that and say that, hey, this isn't right.
But how did they bypass that? Do they not have to go to the science board?
No, they just tweak. Like they don't necessarily have to be scientists. They have to be programmers and just see what happens.
So they don't have to comply.
You're not bypassing it. You're actually accepting it when you agree on the
But that's the part. Are you really accepting to be experimented on? I mean, I'm accepting to use their services. I'm not like.
Yeah, I see your point.
You know what I'm saying?
Like, I think it's a bit weird as well.
At least add.
Yeah.
You force them to change in terms of service.
Yeah,
That's what we are trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney for companies, so I advise on those types of issues. And I think that, I can't see you up there, but I think that the issue is that there is no standard or regulation about these types of things. Like there are, for example, like consumer protection, if you're gonna get like open a bank account, whatever. But if you're looking at like what's in terms of service, or what's ethical about changing an algorithm, that's just something that there is no standard for regulation on. So until you get to that point, then there will potentially be like some type of review process, but that is on the national level, or maybe would begin at probably the state level in the US.
Right, so you need to
or maybe
politically.
European countries are like an EU standard, and then those types of things could change. So I think it's very curious, like very interesting questions around that, but that until there's a bigger dialogue about that, you will have that problem. Like tech companies run those experiments all the time, and we only learn about limited ones. So it's very interesting.
Right, yeah. So if we keep talking about this, then maybe people get interested. Yeah. Yeah.
How many have actually read? I haven't, but how many have actually read the fine text for Facebook or Apple or like when you buy a Mac or something? I thought I don't. It's 8 points and it's about 82 pages, and I just do agree.
Yes.
And I tell people, Facebook is Facebook. It's a multi-billionaire company, and you sort of give away your firstborn.
Yeah.
They own all your text and your songs and your music and your pictures and your life.
Yeah.
That's it. It's free of charge.
Yeah. But I don't want to push this that like they're evil or something.
No.
It's just this is the incentive of the marketplace.
Yeah.
If you don't do this, then someone else will do that, and they will take your place, and they will not make money. So until you change the business model that is viable, this will happen. So it's not that Zuckerberg is not evil, like. So I'm not saying that you're saying that, but. So,
No, I'm on Facebook. I have a big group there, so I'm on Facebook a lot.
Yeah.
I try to do good.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. So the last thing. So. Should I put this on? Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn if anyone wants to talk to me about this, and I have a Facebook page and a recent page. So if this was interesting, this is very surface. I can't cover 200 pages just talking. So if this was interesting, I would love to maybe buy my book. It would be very nice. And I do these lectures as well. And if you're in an organization or some place where you think this information would be nice to have, I'm happy to contact and go and talk about it as well. So just feel free to contact me or just come up to me now. But I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.